Hi, my name is Kathy Fern, and I am passionate about this cause because I have two young adult sons who were in high school at the time vaping came around, and it became a huge issue at their high school as well as other places in the city. I want to thank Congressman Krista Murphy for being a real champion in this fight from the very beginning. He held some of the first hearings on vaping in Congress, and now I'd like to pass it on to Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy.
Hi, everybody. I'm Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy of the 8th District of Illinois. It's wonderful to address you virtually. I want to say thank you to PAVe for your collaboration all these years as we combat the youth vaping epidemic. And I agree with you, we need to clear the vapor, which is exactly what you're doing today. Today, unfortunately, way too many of our high schoolers and young people are vaping. Last year, a study showed that 28% of high school students use e-cigarettes, including vapes. That means millions of American kids are vaping, often without their parents' or grandparents' knowledge. To make matters worse, Big Tobacco has specifically targeted our children by introducing flavors like bubble gum and fruit punch with the goal of hooking kids into a lifetime of nicotine addiction. Just like when Congress acted in the 1990s against Big Tobacco, the time has come to take action once again. This is why just last month I joined with Senators Dick Durbin and Ron Wyden to introduce the bicameral Tobacco Tax Equity Act. This particular act would close tax code loopholes for tobacco products by establishing a new federal tax on e-cigarettes. Increasing the price of tobacco products is the most effective way to reduce tobacco use, particularly among children, and study after study shows this. As we've seen with the cigarettes, increasing the tax on tobacco products coincided with fewer Americans smoking. This is a goal I am working towards in Congress with a bipartisan congressional caucus to end the youth vaping epidemic. And I want to say thank you to PAVe for working with our bipartisan caucus over the years. By increasing the tax on e-cigarettes, the FDA will have more funding to exercise their enforcement authority. That includes removing candy and fruity flavored vapes from the shelves. Thank you for everything that you are doing to end the youth vaping epidemic, and I look forward to seeing you again in person soon. Thank you again, PAVe.
Well, thank you again to Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy. And actually, what he talked about is in line with what we heard from Brian King at the beginning, that they need more funds. But before we go to our prestigious and exciting panel on cannabis, apologies, I want to introduce Michael Tynan, who is, hopefully is here, there he is, who is the policy team lead at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention from OSH, the Office of Smoking and Health, Office of Smoking and Health, which I know well, for introductory remarks. This is the first time that Parents Against Vaping has addressed the issue of cannabis in our many, many years. Okay, it's the third year of our Clear the Vapor conference, and we've only been around for 5 years. This is an issue that parents really care about and ask us about all the time. So I know we'll have a great panel discussion. Michael, we really appreciate your agreeing to give us sort of a thought-leading introduction from your perspective and your experience, having worked with legalization at the state level before. And so take it away, Michael, and thanks for joining us. And then we'll get to our amazing panel. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Meredith. So before I begin, CDC does want to remind folks that in the fall and the winter, viruses that cause respiratory diseases circulate more heavily in the community, and this includes COVID-19, flu, and RSV. It can really have a big impact on people who are older, have chronic diseases. They tend to be at a higher risk of severe outcomes for these viruses. The good news is we have tools to fight them in the form of vaccines, which are available for all three of these viruses. So we recommend keeping up with your preventative care, and this includes talking to your healthcare provider about vaccines. So please talk to your healthcare provider about it during this important time. So I'm here from the Office on Smoking and Health. I've been at CDC since 2008. But as Meredith mentioned, there was a 3-year period from 2013 to 2016 where I managed the policy team at the Oregon Health Department. And I was responsible for the public health rule development on cannabis at that time, which I can talk to you about cannabis until you don't want to talk to me about it anymore. After I rejoined CDC, I began to work on cannabis and tobacco overlap issues. And a question I get a lot is, can we even work on cannabis or should we work on cannabis? After all, we're a tobacco program and we're not a cannabis program. And the answer I have for state tobacco control programs or local tobacco control programs or partner organizations who focus on tobacco is yes. Yes, you can work on cannabis. Our work is not done in a vacuum. If this is a question you have, that's okay. I think a lot of us have had to take some time to get our heads wrapped around this issue. It took me some time to get there too when I was in Oregon. But what I'll line out quickly is we've identified some space at CDC where we think there's some clear overlap that makes a lot of sense. And hopefully that'll set up the next panel pretty clearly. So one space where it's really clear is smoke-free. While cannabis legalization may work to help address criminal justice issues, it's also probably the greatest risk to smoke-free laws that we've seen in the last 20 plus years. There are real risks that these laws will roll back and allow some indoor forms of tobacco use, or I'm sorry, of cannabis use, which can impact tobacco use. If you live in a state or community with a smoke-free law, is smoking or vaping cannabis also captured in your smoke-free law? What do your definitions look like? Are people in your community or your state trying to carve out new opportunities for cannabis use indoors? If they did, how would we be certain that they would be able to be enforced in a way that this just didn't become a new loophole for people to use tobacco, either vaping it or smoking it in these settings? These are questions that government and non-government tobacco control partners need to think about. It's also appropriate to understand the impact that legalization can have on youth initiation and adult use. It's appropriate to fully understand issues of overlapping product use, which can lead to co-use. It can really complicate our surveillance. And the easiest way for me to describe this is talk to you about a story that I'll tell briefly about what happened when I lived in Oregon soon after cannabis was legalized. So voters in November 2014 approved cannabis on the ballot. Then in early 2015, the legislature met and developed the new laws to give authority to state agencies to regulate the marketplace. And then in July, cannabis use was legal for adults. So that's when you were able to legally have it. And I was at a 4th of July barbecue, and it was the afternoon, and there were kids standing around as people were drinking alcohol. And because that's what society says is okay, right? Like it's some sort of level of responsible alcohol use. You can have it in front of kids, right? At a barbecue setting or something like that. After a couple of hours, or I soon noticed that someone actually removed themselves from the party and like walked around the corner of a garage to go smoke a cigarette. And maybe that was actually part of that person's quit journey, like that was part of them, like the social norms had changed and such, they had to remove themselves. And a couple of hours later, the kids went home, including mine. They probably went to get on screens, which is a whole nother public health talk altogether. And if we were in person, you'd laugh and it'd be funny and we'd talk about that. But we're not. And so I'm going to keep going. And that's when I noticed when the kids were gone that people started to smoke cannabis, and they didn't remove themselves from the party. They didn't, go around the corner the way that the person who smoked tobacco was, but they also didn't use it around kids either. And so our job is to pay attention to those social norms and see how things changed. And if they did or didn't, does it matter? Because it may not, right? And so if we have alcohol on one end of the spectrum and cannabis on the other, and cannabis starts to get treated more like alcohol, what does that do to tobacco use? Does it bring tobacco use along with the spectrum more as well or not? And so that's our job in tobacco use, to figure out what in tobacco prevention, like what is happening? How do social norms change? How do they change around social acceptability of smoking? And as we do this work, as we work on cannabis, we have to acknowledge that there's not as much as we know about tobacco. We don't know as much about cannabis as we know about tobacco, due in part because of its legal status federally over time. But there are potentially therapeutic benefits for some patients of cannabis. Now, there are different conditions that have been proved by different states. So state conditions will vary, and the evidence is emerging. And we also don't know if there are different chemical compounds that benefit the user versus the whole plant that yields these benefits. But this is something that's very different about how we talk about commercial tobacco use in public health, and that's okay. And we're also learning more about the adverse effects of cannabis use, and more research is needed for many of the impacts. And many of the studies that we have to date have been complicated by tobacco co-use. So we have to be honest about what we do and don't know about the health effects, but it doesn't mean we can't say anything. We can apply the precautionary principle, especially as we know for people who are inhaling smoke, for example, the cannabis smoke contains many of the same toxins and carcinogens in tobacco smoke. CDC has a website on this that can be a little bit helpful. So as you moved into the space, these are some things to think about. We aren't starting from scratch. There are numerous states, some legacy cannabis legalization states that were the early adopters in the early part of the last decade that developed some public health and safety regulations that can balance public health concerns with implementing legalized cannabis for adult users. In some of these states, they've developed a marketplace where sales look like 21 and over stores that only sell cannabis and cannabis accessories. They're not a convenience store. People are carded upon entry. They have high license fees that cost thousands of dollars. And we would be framed as prohibitionists if we did this in tobacco. But this is what legalization looks like on cannabis. So how can we maximize that space in the retail space to get tobacco sold like an adult-only product, like many other adult-only products are sold? So just here to say, as I close, to consider these considerations. It's absolutely okay to work on this space and to identify the impact that cannabis has on adult tobacco use, youth initiation, and norms around tobacco use and smoking in public. But you have to address public health concerns in an objective and believable manner. This means acknowledging what we do and don't know about both the harms and the potential therapeutic benefits, because we have to build trust with the community on this issue. It's important to acknowledge what we do and don't know in this space, but it doesn't mean that we can't do our work. So Meredith, hopefully that's what you wanted me to cover. And I'm glad you guys are talking about this. I'm looking forward to what the panel has to say.
Thanks. And had we been in person, we would have laughed. I put ha in the chat. So I did appreciate that. And Michael, no, thank you so much. I mean, it's real, I think probably in particular, as you said, for a lot of the public health folks and the state public health folks and local public health folks that are on this call, on this conference, this idea about can they or could they or should they not talk about cannabis because it's not yet federally legal, I think was important. And now we'll jump into our longer conversation. So thank you so much, Michael Tynan. Really appreciate your thought leading on that. And now we're going to turn to what we are calling cannabis and tobacco, the co-use conundrum. And our three panelists, esteemed panelists, are Amy Cohn, who is Associate Professor, General and Community Pediatrics at the Stevenson Cancer Center at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center. Bonnie Halpern-Felsher, by the way, they all are doctor. I'm just putting that out there, and I'm calling them by their first names, but I don't want to take away from the fact that these are PhDs and MDs and MPHs, et cetera. Dr. Bonnie Halpern-Felsher, Dr. Amy Cohn, who is an endowed professor at Stanford Medical School, the Kendrick Professor in Pediatrics, and also the founder and executive director of a bunch of really great toolkits, including for this conversation, the Cannabis Awareness and Prevention Toolkit from Stanford Medical School, and Dr. Pam Ling, who is director of the UCSF Center for Tobacco Control Research and Education. And if it is okay with our panelists, I'm just going to refer to you by your first names because we're a parent group and sort of grassroots and casual. So, but thank you. And so really the reason I even say that is this is something that we have been hearing about from parents for years, and we're only 5 years old, but this is something that is very much on parents' minds. And so many of us in the space are parents. I mean, Dorian and Mimi and I remain full-time volunteers. And between us, I don't even know how many kids we have. I know I have 4. And I think so many parents that we hear from every day are obviously very concerned because their kids are vaping nicotine, but almost every single one of the parents that we hear from is either concerned because those kids, and this is obviously anecdotal, I'm going to get to some facts and figures in a moment, but just anecdotally, I can say that in the demographic that we hear from all the time of parents, they're the kids who are already vaping nicotine, and so many of those and are using with such frequency that they are clearly addicted to nicotine, they're either also frequently using cannabis, or the parents fear that they will soon be. So this is very much on parents' minds. And so I would love, Amy, maybe you could start by sort of setting the stage for us. What is the co-use landscape like now? I mean, how much do we know about it, and where do you think it's going?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, and I appreciate everyone's attention at the end of the day. So I know we're here to talk about cannabis vaping, but the co-use landscape really extends to a variety of tobacco products that are co-used with cannabis. I think overwhelmingly what we do see is that e-cigarettes are the most popular product that tends to be co-used with cannabis among youth and also young adults, who's that kind of transitional age from 18 to 24 or 25. And then little cigars are also very popular in terms of co-use products. And I think you bring up a good point, Meredith, that, overwhelmingly, if you're a youth or a young adult and you're using an e-cigarette, you're also just more likely to use cannabis and other tobacco and other substances as well. So we tend to see, these behaviors clustering behavior together. And I have a saying, like, bad stuff goes with bad stuff. So if you're, already using tobacco products, it's highly likely that you might be using the gamut of other, like alcohol and, cannabis and maybe other substances as well, just because those things tend to hang together. I would also say, just in terms of the co-use sphere, we do still tend to see that combusted cannabis use is really the most popular form of use. But we do see combusted cannabis use going together with combusted tobacco use. So young people will engage in what's called chasing behavior, where they may, use cannabis, probably combusted form, and then they'll chase that with, let's say, a cigarette, because, a cigarette will kind of increase the high of, smoking cannabis. Or we'll see that combusted cannabis will come in the form of smoking a blunt. So taking, all or some of the tobacco out of a cigar product and replacing it with cannabis. And so you get what I call the double whammy of toxicants. So you not only get toxicant exposure from combusted cannabis, but you also get it from some combusted tobacco. And there has been research to show that cigar wrappers do include some level of nicotine in them. And so young people, may misperceive that, hey, I'm taking out the tobacco from this cigar product, so I'm reducing my harm. But in fact, they are still ingesting, nicotine, even though they may think that they're not. That is definitely a concern. And then just the final thing I'll say, about the co-use spheres, that we do tend to see, very lower perceptions of harm among youth, again, and young adults who co-use cannabis and tobacco, which is, again, concerning because, when you tend to use these products together, they actually do increase harm in terms of, secondhand smoke exposure, obviously exposure to, toxicants that I said before. So the lower perceptions of harm don't tend to map on to the increased harm one would experience from co-use. And then we, I'm sure many of these people in this meeting are familiar with EVALI, where young people were experiencing lung-related health issues from vaping cannabis, and the misperception that it was from, just regular e-cigarette vapes, but it was primarily from vaping cannabis and the oils and cannabis-related products.
Well, I'm so glad, by the way, that you brought that up. I mean, there are so much more that we could be talking about. So just as an aside, and I think we could, we can have, we're not going to have another day, but we'll definitely be having more conversations about this. And I think actually several hours ago, it was Dr. Sharon Levy in the conversation about creative cessation who said, people think this problem went away because you don't see the flashy Juul ads anymore. This problem is still very much a problem. And I want to say the same about EVALI, which is that EVALI was followed weekly by CDC until I think late February or early March of 2020 when COVID started. Now I've heard CDC officials say, well, that they didn't just stop it because of COVID, whatever the reason, we stopped following it. And I know Bonnie, you were included in an article in Medscape, and others on this call were too, that showed that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of cases of EVALI. Some were not being coded. And to your point, Amy, just to remember, and I know this is not a panel about EVALI, but since you brought it up, that while the majority of those cases from 2019 into 2020 were related to the vitamin E acetate thickening agent in cannabis, I think there was something like somewhere between 12 and 14%, am I right, of cases that came from nicotine only. And that tracks with what we continue to hear from parents whose kids end up in the hospital with EVALI. So that is not just about cannabis. But going back to the co-use, and Amy, I just have one final question. I would just love it if you have, there's not a lot of research, but what would you say are the best range of figures, or what figures would you say if we're looking at co-use in this cohort? What would you say? Anecdotally, we feel it's pretty high. Are there numbers that you're using, or are there others who want to just sort of give us a range or the best number that's out there? And then I'm going to then switch to Bonnie and then to Pam, and then we can just have a conversation.
Sure. And Bonnie and Pam may also, have other data to present. But when I've looked at kind of recent national data from a large population-based survey that many of the researchers who are here have probably used, the PATH data set, we tend to see that among tobacco-using youth, co-use is reported by about 8% of them. So it's not super high, but if we think about what cigarette smoking rates are, it's a little bit higher. And then if we kind of break it down, and I'm just thinking about, cannabis vaping, since this is, one of the, key areas of interest for this meeting, depending on what the age breakdown is, we do see that, past year cannabis vaping has increased moderately. So over time, we do see, cannabis vaping, if we look at past year, it's about 7% as of 2019 among 8th graders. We see it's higher in 12th graders. And again, this is from the Monitoring the Future study. So this is, valid population-based data. We do see, past year cannabis vaping reported by about 20% of 12th graders, which I think makes sense and kind of tracks with what we'd expect from that age group, that they're kind of ready to transition onto college. And then when we see the young adult age group, that's 18 to 24, their rates of past year cannabis vaping is about 21%. So if you put this in context with current tobacco use rates and current, among youth, I think cannabis vaping kind of tracks at a similar level, around 7% if we look at past year use.
Thanks. Right. And the CDC says between 18 and 24-year-olds, 10% of them, right, the most recent data, which was from 2021, are are vaping on a regular basis. So that would make sense. Bonnie, let me ask you the same, maybe you have some additional data you want to share. And then I sort of wanted to ask you the question about, this is not your parents' cannabis, that the way the kids look at it, it's how much more potent is it? And then does the delivery system, which, as you said, that maybe is the use is more combustible, and of course edibles, which we won't even go into that for the moment, but does the delivery system we've been talking about, the use of e-cigarettes that makes the nicotine, that the hit is so much more potent because it's more directly delivered to the brain. I know I'm translating the science, so if I'm misspeaking, please correct me. But does cannabis delivered through an e-cigarette have the same response, i.e. that you're getting enormous amounts? Are you getting so much more potency of the substance because of the way it's delivered?
So all great questions, and hello everybody. So excited to be here. Thank you, Meredith and PAVe, for your invitation. Let me highlight a few of the points. First, just to go to Amy's question or Amy's comments, which I 100% agree with. I want to, and Amy, you touched on this just a little bit more for parents or others who are here, that when you're talking about co-use, you can be talking about different definitions, and Amy highlighted a few, so not disagreeing, more codifying those. So yeah, absolutely, you can have where you're using two products either simultaneously or next to each other, so the chaser idea, but where you're vaping or smoking tobacco and nicotine in the vaping, smoking, or eating some cannabis product after, and that does double or really enhance the high, and young people know that, and they'll say, I'm doing the co-use to enhance the high. So that's sort of one after the other. You can also use where somebody is co-using a day apart or a week apart. They just happen to be, depending on what products they have available to them, what it is that they feel like using that day, if they're going to school or if they're at home or at a party. And then another way is absolutely the co-use, where like the blunt that Amy was mentioning, where the product itself has a combination of the cannabis and the nicotine at the same time. And one of the ways in terms of e-cigarette use that we're seeing, a lot of young people are taking a traditional nicotine e-cigarette, used to be Juul, now Elf Bar or the Escobar or some other product, and vaping half of it, inhaling half, and then adding in the cannabis oil to that after. So that way they're actually creating, and I talked to one young person who said, yeah, I was using a cherry vape, got through half of it, nicotine vape, got through half of it. Then I added the cannabis to it, and now I had a cherry flavored cannabis, and he was very proud of himself. So this is not uncommon. It's, when we were here in the Vapes Are Trash session earlier, the warning of don't open these, don't take the battery out, don't open them. Young people are, and not very hard to find a YouTube video to learn how to open these products, unfortunately, without showing gloves or any other protective gear, and then adding in the different ingredients. So I just want to make that clear for the audience of the different, and there are other ways too, but those are the difference. And absolutely agree with Amy that still combustible joints or bongs are ways that young people are using most, but e-cigarettes is increasing in use. And I also wanted to mention around that a couple other things. In terms of rates, we actually just have a study that we are going to be submitting for publication soon. My postdoc, Devin McCulley, actually presented on this at the Tobacco Regulatory Science meeting just last week. And in a group of our own data, not so replicating what PAVe has and NYTS, our own data of national 13 to 25-year-olds, we saw that amongst those who were using tobacco or cannabis, 75+% were using both products. And what we're doing, our contribution is what came first and at what age and what's the time frame between going from one product to the other. We saw overwhelmingly participants started with the nicotine e-cigarette and then moved to the cannabis e-cigarette, and that happened within a year, if you look at time frame there. So it's very common for people to be transitioning from one product to another, and then again to go back and forth on them. In terms of the hit that you were talking about, and Pam hopefully can explain even more of this than I can, but I wouldn't say that the absorption or the addiction potential or abuse liability is so much higher in vaping versus smoking. It's more that the formula, like we see with the salt-based nicotine, is stronger and more potent and higher levels of nicotine, and therefore it goes through faster. It's not the device per se, you're inhaling both. It's what's in there, the ingredients within there. But having said that, the problem with e-cigarette, there are many problems with e-cigarettes, but here is that these are the products that people can use 24/7. You're not going to smoke in bed as much. You're not going to wake up in the middle of the night and keep your combusted cigarette or e-cigarette cigarette or cannabis cigarette or nicotine cigarette under your pillow. Young people are keeping their vaping device under their pillow. And so they're waking up in the middle of the night and taking hits. So in that sense, yes, they are getting more nicotine. They are getting more THC. They're using these round the clock and more regularly. And that is a huge concern that we have as well. And I had another thought, but I'll come back to it.
Okay. So I will turn to Pam. I just want to understand, but the cannabis that is being however it's being consumed now, when you look at 30 years ago, I mean,
Oh,
my
thank you.
understanding,
Yes.
or sort of like
Yes.
the lay person's understanding is that this is what percentage more potent than if you were smoking a joint or smoking, flower or weed,
Right.
versus doing so now.
Yeah, thank you. I remember, Meredith, you had a couple extra questions, so keep reminding me of those. So now if you were, it's significantly, it's at least 10 times more potent now, the THC levels. And if you're looking at dabbing, for example, which is not in an e-cigarette, but dabbing, actually you can put that in an e-cigarette. That's
Can you
80%
describe to people
THC.
listening in case they don't know what that is?
Yeah, it's a highly concentrated THC, often in the form of a wax. But the idea is it's extremely concentrated and created that way. And so it's about 80% THC versus the, a few percent when, I always say, you're right, not your grandma's THC. And I think the more traditional e-cigarette, or excuse me, cannabis, e-cigarettes or vapes are more in the 20% range. I think it's about that. So if you look at generally the calculations people would say now is that the cannabis today is at least 10 times what it was when we were kids or our parents were kids. And it's about one joint now is about 10 joints 30 years ago or so. So it's extremely high.
Right. All right. Well, thank you. Chilling.
Yeah, it is. I do remember the one other thing I just want to say really,
Sure.
really quickly. I remembered is, and what Amy was also saying, and around this EVALI and everything, I think that we did do a good job getting the word out, and we did start seeing reductions in e-cigarette use from EVALI, COVID, whatever it is. But we've done a bunch of studies, and others have too, asking young people about quitting. And what young people are saying to us is, oh yeah, I'm not going to use a nicotine e-cigarette. And they're moving to THC e-cigarettes, thinking that it's a harm reduction approach. And so that's been our other concern as well. And sorry.
Well, no, thank you. And Pam, I'm going to turn to you about that and about some other things that relate to policy and perception. I think you even said you may have a slide about marketing. I mean, all of this. I mean, we could do, and I know Bonnie, we've, Dorian and I have been 2 years in a row, I think, or 3 even, on your cannabis conference. And as we said, this is the first time that we're talking about it, but it is something that is very much on parents' minds. And particularly because whether marijuana becomes federally legal, I don't know, it's 4:15 at 5 o'clock today or 5 o'clock tomorrow or in 5 weeks or 5 months or whenever it does, that is coming at us like a freight train. And so I just want to say, and I think you would probably all agree, we know that the tobacco industry has been heavily investing in cannabis outside of the US. We know from our work around the country, our advocacy and our education, that in some cases, in some states, we have seen that the tobacco industry has been funding, the pro-cannabis legalization fight in a state, because in the end, once it's federally legal, they're going to swoop in. And this generation that has been primed for at least this particular delivery system, I mean, I would assume, that as Carol Bruder said earlier, they're always 10 steps ahead. That's the big game. That's what they're going towards. But Pam, I would love to hear from, one of the things that I was very struck by at the last, I think it was the FDA public hearing about tobacco, and you and your colleagues talked about cannabis at a hearing that was about tobacco. And so I would really love to understand sort of your comments on what we've heard so far and why you brought up to FDA looking at the marketing of cannabis when they were talking about tobacco. Now, obviously, I think I know the answer to that question, because what we're really getting at is the intersection, the dangerous intersection for our kids and for young people between tobacco and cannabis, which, here in New York City, where there's a terrible lack of enforcement, and we'll discuss later on another panel, while cannabis has been legal in our city and in our state for a short period of time, it is being sold illegally by unlicensed retailers who, by the way, are also selling illegal flavored vapes for which there's no enforcement. It's just a big mess. So I'm going to hand that mess over to Pam Ling and see, Pam, how you would start by attacking that for us and guiding us on all of this.
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. I also
Thanks for
appreciate
nothing, Meredith, for handing the mess to me. Right, sorry.
Yes, thanks, Meredith. I think the point we wanted to make to FDA was that even though FDA doesn't currently have authority to regulate cannabis, the agency needs to be thinking about it and preparing for cannabis regulation, because we know it's, coming down the line. The FDA has asked for information about cannabis, but there's a lot of lessons learned from tobacco regulation that could be readily applied to cannabis. If I can share my screen really fast, I just wanted to show you this one slide here. So this is Brian King's slide that he showed today, talking about the warning letters that FDA sent to these e-cigarette companies for their cartoon and toy and school supply products. I saw this announcement from the FDA while I had COVID. And so I went on the internet and searched around, and it did not take me very long to find cannabis products that do exactly the same marketing techniques, looking like school supplies, toys, and food. And, the FDA is sending warning letters to the ones on the left, and nobody is doing anything about the products on the right, which clearly, are also doing SpongeBob and Game Boys and toy looking products.
I would argue, by the way, that those warning letters don't do anything, even though they're getting them. The FDA does not share with us. All right, they don't share.
These products are not even being, they're not even getting warning letters. So, in addition to thinking about just being able to pay attention to the marketing, though, the FDA, we know from tobacco regulation, right, that you can limit flavors. You could put limits on potency or the amount of THC in products. You could put effective warning labels on products, or better packaging or plain packaging. We've had a huge rise in poisonings from our poison control in California, mostly from edibles that are packaged to look just like cookies and candy, and they have almost microscopic levels of trying to find that warning label on the packaging. So there are, I think what we're really trying to push for is for people to take lessons learned from what we already know about fighting the youth vaping epidemic here, and saying, like, let's not wait until, we're facing another epidemic. We already know, I think our data is that co-use of tobacco and cannabis is higher rates than cannabis use alone. And there was a survey in California last year of teens that found that over half of the ones using tobacco are also using cannabis products. So in a state where cannabis is legalized, there's a long history of people using cannabis for medical reasons, and it's very normalized. You really have widespread perceptions that cannabis is okay, and very aggressive marketing.
So Michael Tynan, to lead this off, thank you, Pam. But Michael Tynan, that's great. I mean, the matcha latte, Starbucks, marijuana, whatever that was, is just sickening. Michael made reference to the social norms, keeping an eye on the social norms. So I just want to go back, and I'm going to open this up to all of you. The question of perception. Now, I have kids in that category. And I've heard conversations between, my kids and their friends, about, well, so-and-so, he's using weed every day, but, that doesn't mean he's addicted. So let's just for a moment talk about cannabis use disorder, because I feel like the perception is that you cannot get, and I don't think it's just among young people. I think that there's this perception that cannabis is not addictive. Is that true, or is it not true? And what does the data show? And does the data show only for adults? Does it show yet for young people? Does it matter? what can we learn about that today? I think Bonnie may have had to go off.
I think Amy
Yeah,
has.
I'm back. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to this briefly. I mean, I think cannabis use is tricky because if we think biologically about how THC acts in the system, it has a very long half-life. So even if you stop using it, you don't go through the typical withdrawals that people would expect. Like if you quit smoking, you experience withdrawal. If you quit drinking, if you're a heavy drinker, you experience withdrawal. And so that leads people to misperceive that they must not be addicted because the cannabis will stay in your body for a very long time before you might experience some symptoms. I think the other tricky thing with thinking about cannabis use disorder is that, you know, many of the symptoms or problems that people might use cannabis for, like depression or anxiety, you know, can be abated acutely with cannabis use, but over time, if somebody stops using cannabis or cuts down, or maybe doesn't increase their cannabis use, those symptoms kind of come back and they get even worse. And so then people may use more to continue to medicate those problems. And so you see this really unfortunate boomerang effect. And then if we think about, you know, teens in particular, and this is just, you know, kind of my perspective, you know, when you think about what dependence symptoms look like, it's really hard to extract. Is that just my teen being a teen and being emotional and just going through, you know, kind of growing life stresses, or is that because they're using cannabis? So maybe they are, you know, having lack of concentration. Maybe they're more irritable. Maybe they're depressed. Maybe they're anxious. They're having sleep problems. They're eating more. They're eating less. And so I feel like some of the symptoms that we might look for when somebody has a use disorder diagnosis are also just really tough to diagnose when you have a teen who's just going through the general life stages of being a teenager.
This is the same conversation that parents are having, trying to figure out if their kids are addicted to nicotine. You know, like we have on our website, the 10 signs. You know, they're always going to the bathroom, or you know, they seem edgy or anxious, or there's a change in how they eat, et cetera. And you're like, well, they're a teen. You know, they're edgy and anxious. It's like premenopausal or whatever it is. So it's very hard to know, and that sounds very similar. I feel like we've done so much messaging over these last few years, and still does the message get out to parents, even to educators, that, you know, about nicotine addiction? I'm so frightened thinking that it could take many, many years before the messaging about cannabis use disorder, that it even exists, because people don't think you can be addicted to cannabis. So what can we do to make sure that the messaging changes fairly quickly when we know that the landscape is changing very quickly? And I'm going to toss it to anyone who wants to answer that, because I think you're all experts and you all have great perspectives. And I just want to make sure that parents who are listening, including this parent, really gets to hear your wisdom and guidance on this, because we're all very worried about it.
Yeah, I want to jump in and then I want to throw it to Bonnie, because I just wanted to say that I agree around this recognition sometimes of things that happen with cannabis, like can be signs of addiction, but people may not think of it. So you talk to folks who use cannabis, they'll talk about they need to take tolerance breaks. You know, they'll take tolerance breaks so that they can build, they lower their tolerance so they can save money. But a lot of times young people may not realize that building a tolerance is part of addiction. So in some ways, it's like framing some of these things that you might experience and saying, you know, this is a sign of addiction. It's not just, you know, part of using weed. And then, you know, I think education around this is something we really can do now. And Bonnie, you may want to talk a little bit about the cannabis prevention toolkit.
Yeah, thank you. And I was going to bring that up on this topic. So I think it's perfect. And Pam, I completely agree. The tolerance breaks is what I hear a lot from young people when we talk to them. And when you actually describe what addiction is, they start to realize that they are addicted, but they don't realize it at the outset. And Meredith, I think your question, before I get to toolkit, but I think your question is perfect, because when I talk, you know, like you, around the country, thousands of schools and parents and educators and people adults will say, well, it's not addictive. And you say, no, it is. And we explain it. And if you look at the brain process, it's not really any different. Drug, any addictive substance is going to change your brain. So that brings up the toolkit. So it was put in the chat earlier at the beginning of the PAVe conference today. But my lab has created the Cannabis Awareness and Prevention Toolkit and the Tobacco Prevention Toolkit. But on both of those, on the tobacco one, we have our You and Me Together Vape-Free curriculum that has a 1-hour lesson on cannabis. And then the cannabis toolkit has Smart Talk, which is a full lesson. We have elementary, middle, and high school curriculums. We're evidence-based. They're curriculums for schools, but we also have healthcare providers using these, counselors, school resource officers, and all of those are being used in the curriculum. Schools are using them, and we go into brain development. We talk about addiction. It was mentioned earlier by the young people, that wonderful panel, about not just talking about health effects, which we do, but also we talk about marketing. We have a whole lesson on stress and coping, and a whole lesson on how do you refuse and how do you say no, or safely say no, or cut back and reduce if you are somebody who's using. So definitely encourage people to take a look at those. They are completely free. And in fact, we are starting to, most of the schools in New York are now using that curriculum. We're going to be working with New York State. We also do have an alternative to suspension curriculum for
Yes.
both cannabis and nicotine in there. And that is both self-paced and counselor-led. So just encourage you, again, they're completely free. I'm not selling anything, but these are widely used, millions of young people. And would just encourage, because a lot of things that we're talking about and that I've been hearing on this conference today are addressed in those curriculums. And there's some materials.
No, that's fantastic. And as you said, this is free. And so is our conference. And as I said, this parent and all the parents and all the educators, I mean, I think this is a topic that we have not addressed. And we know that it's, as you said, coming at us like a freight train. I do want to say there is a question, which I think is really interesting. And I think we have, unfortunately, because I could talk to all three of you for a really long time about this, and we have about 6 more minutes. Someone has asked, actually, Dr. Mock, Jeremiah Mock is asking about youth first episode psychosis triggered by cannabis, particularly the high potency cannabis products with 80% plus THC, and he references emergency department admissions. And I actually, frankly, I wouldn't have thought to ask that question, but I think we talked a little bit about the potency. We're talking about lack of, there's the regulation I see here in New York City, the intersection, these things are colliding and there's terrible lack of enforcement. So I'd love, with my 5-minute warning, just to see if there's someone who wants to briefly comment about that, because the potency issue is frightening to parents. And this is related to that. Is there anybody who, and if this is not something that we can always send an answer later if it's not something that anybody feels they have the right research on. I just wanted to bring it up because I'm interested in that as well. But maybe
I think Dr. Mock is right? One of the really kind of scary things we've heard and that we see in emergency rooms is, people sometimes think that the really highly potent products or, doing dabs is just fun and it's super strong, but it does have this risk of triggering psychosis, especially with the very potent products. And so, we know that the cannabis exposure is not good for the developing brain, so even though there's lots we don't know about cannabis, we do know that there are risks to folks whose brain is still developing under the age of 25. And there is good evidence that exposure to these high potency products can trigger psychosis. So people who have psychosis in the family or who have any kind of those mental health predispositions do risk this very severe health problem related to high potency cannabis. And to go back to the marketing, when they make dab rigs in the shape of Starbucks cups, and you can get a driving dab rig to put in your cup holder in your car. It really normalizes and makes it seem like using a high potency form like a concentrate is, it's just a way to save money or just fun, and it really can be quite dangerous.
Right. Well, I just to put in the parking lot for future, I'd love to have the same group back and have broader conversations. I mean, one of the things that we think a lot about is lack of messaging for pregnant women and nicotine. and we hear from partners who are OBGYNs, like their fear about a lack of messaging about pregnant women, young women, and cannabis use. And especially when you think about the early adopters of Juul, many of them who may have moved on to cannabis and may have not only be addicted to nicotine, but have cannabis use disorder. And now they're thinking about having children. That's something just to put a pin in for later. But I just want to say, in the few minutes we have left, if each of you could just sort of share, we always want to give parents hope, because it feels so hopeless. Like, oh my gosh, now we have to worry about this, the marketing, the potency. So would you each just sort of wrap up and just sort of give us something to think about, or how we can protect our kids or be more aware? I'd really appreciate it. So Amy, I'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think for me, because I do a lot of policy work, I think what you can do now to be proactive is find your local, if you're in a legal cannabis state, find your local cannabis regulatory authority and find a way to connect with them and talk to them. Because I think in many states that the cannabis policy, because we don't have a federal policy, is just not fully developed. I think in states like California and Colorado and Washington, which have had legal cannabis for a while, they are. But if you're in a more emerging state where cannabis is recently legalized, I really do urge you to find, the stakeholder that does oversee cannabis in your state. Or if you're not a legalized state, find out who would be interested in legalizing it in your state and who are the people you can talk to so you can get out ahead of the issue. And I think the last thing I just want to say, I don't want to take up all the time, is that I wouldn't be scared if there was federal legalization, because actually from that could trickle a lot more bodies of oversight and federal regulation rather than piecemeal state by state regulation. For example, being in Oklahoma, it's very different than other places of the state. There is very limited regulation. And if we had federal legalization, I think we would actually have better oversight, better messaging program, more funding. So find the people who can be your allies, either if cannabis is legalized in your state or if it were to be. Who are those people you can talk to and kind of get a bug in their ear now?
That's great. Pam, I'm going to ask you again, and then Bonnie, just sort of give us something to hold on to, because this is a big issue and it's probably going to get bigger for parents with young adults and kids.
Yeah, well, somewhat selfishly, because I'm a researcher, I do think that we need more research on cannabis right now with the way the legal status is. We have to go get special federally regulated weed to do studies, and we can't even go down the street and buy a product and study it in a lab at UCSF, because we risk our federal funding. So having advocacy so that we can actually do research on the products that kids are using would be super helpful. And then the second point is, along with Amy, is that, in states where you do have legalization, a lot of the motivation is to maximize making money and tax revenue and kind of protecting that legal market. And we need parent voices to say, we need to protect our kids and our children, and not just the legal market in the state. And without the parent voice saying that, the forces that are really just want to maximize revenue from legalized cannabis are really drowning out right now.
Right. And for us, that will be, I think for us, we talk so much about flavors in a legal cannabis retailer here in New York City. They are legally selling cereal milk cannabis vapes, which I think is extremely problematic. Bonnie, I'll let you finish and then I'll just say thank you and we'll go on to the next thing.
No worries. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Meredith. I completely agree with everything that Amy and Pam said. And as a researcher, I would also say we don't know enough about the epidemiology and the reasons for use. I have a postdoc in my lab, Jessica Liu, who's working on that topic of sort of what influences co-use or progression from one to another. So I completely agree. We need a lot more research on these topics. And I would say for parents, and I'm also a parent, and my kids are young adults and adults, but I would say, talk to your kids. That's the most important thing, and use the resources that you're having today. I always say, after you hear a conference like this, go home and say, Johnny, Sally, whatever, I heard this conference and I want to ask, and you're not pushing them to give you an answer of what they're doing yet. You're just opening the door and having that conversation. In some studies that we publish, young people say, if you don't talk to us, I assume it's okay to do it. So keep the conversation going, get educated, and, be prepared for those hard questions like, well, it's legal. Why can't I use it? Well, it's not legal until you're 21. Well, it should be 25, but that's another 3-hour conversation. But in terms of brain development, but there's a reason why there's an age limit to it. And we're worried about your brains. We're worried about your lung health. We're worried about your health. And that's why that we're saying it's not okay to be using at this age. So be prepared for those hard questions, and look at the resources that we all have to help you.
Thank you so much to all three of you. This was a really important and very helpful first conversation for our organization. So I hope that will continue as this issue keeps coming at us. So thank you so much for everything. We really, really appreciate Amy Cohn and Pam Ling and Bonnie Halpern-Felsher. Thank you.